The Remembrance broke formation at dawn on the fourth day. Admiral Cho Mira had transferred command of the remaining human fleet to her second officer and ordered all vessels to fall back to defensive positions around the Futuristic evacuation corridors. She took her dreadnought forward alone, driving straight toward the heart of the swarm, where the Queen Mind waited in its shielded fortress. Talon Moru watched from the eternal vigilance as the massive human ship carved through enemy formations. The Remembrance absorbed damage that would have destroyed any Concord vessel 10 times over. Its hull burned, and its systems failed one by one. But it kept moving forward through the mechanical swarm. Admiral Chomira broadcast one final message on an open channel that every ship in the sector could receive. Her voice was steady despite the chaos around her. She explained that humanity had stayed away from the Concord for 73 years because they were not afraid of alien civilizations or galactic politics. Afraid of themselves. They had seen what power could do in the wrong hands. They had studied their own history and understood how easily strength could become tyranny. So they had built their fleet in secret and waited, testing themselves over 3 generations to make sure they would only use their weapons to protect rather than conquer. She asked the listening ships to tell the Concord that humanity was sorry for every meeting they had missed. They had not been ignoring their invitation. They had been learning to be worthy of it. The Remembrance reached the Queen Mind's fortress as Admiral Cho Mira finished speaking. The dreadnought's weapons were mostly destroyed, its engines failing, its hull breached in 100 places. It did not matter. The ship still had its power core, and that was enough. Talon saw the flash from across the battlefield, a brilliant burst of light that momentarily outshone the stars themselves. The Queen Mind died in that instant of nuclear fire, its shielding overwhelmed by the close-range detonation of a human warship's full reactor output. Admiral Chomira did not survive. The swarm collapsed within minutes of losing its central intelligence. Millions of machines simply stopped functioning, their coordination network destroyed along with the mind that had guided them, the mechanical tide that had threatened to consume galactic civilization became nothing more than drifting wreckage, inert metal floating in the void where the battle had raged. The silence that followed was almost worse than the fighting had been. Talon sat at his station and stared at the empty space where Remembrance had been. 7,200 human ships had come to the Velen threshold. 4,100 remained. 3,000 lives had been lost defending civilizations that had forgotten humans existed. The archivist began writing his final report with trembling hands. 3 months later, the assembly hall on Vulthury Prime was packed beyond capacity for the first time in living memory. Every species had sent delegations to witness the historic session. News drones filled the observation galleries, broadcasting to trillions of viewers across the galaxy. Talon Moru stood at his usual position in the archive section, but he found himself unable to focus on his documentation duties. His eyes kept drifting to chamber 7291, which had been cleaned and restored to its proper condition. The storage boxes were gone. The cleaning supplies had been removed. The blue and green flag of Earth hung straight and proud on the wall behind the empty delegate seat. Ambassador Coordinator Yun Seojin entered the assembly through the main doors, walking slowly down the central aisle while 800 species watched in silence. She was 67 years old, her hair silver and her face lined with age. Her grandmother had been assigned this walk 73 years ago. The weight of all those missed meetings seemed to press down on her shoulders as she approached her chamber. She climbed the steps and stood before the assembled civilizations. Her first words were a formal apology for humanity's long absence. Her voice carried clearly through the hall's perfect acoustics. She acknowledged that Earth had missed every session. Since receiving its invitation, she did not offer excuses or justifications. She simply apologized and asked for the opportunity to begin again. No one objected. Ambassador Yun Seojin took her seat. And for the first time in 73 years, Chamber 7291 had an occupant. She immediately requested speaking time and was granted the floor. Her second statement was a formal motion to establish a permanent mutual defense alliance Earth would contribute funding, technology, and ships to ensure that no civilization would ever face extinction alone. The Galactic Concord would become a true protective force rather than just a diplomatic assembly. The motion was debated for less than an hour before passing. With unanimous support, Talon found himself approaching the human delegation chamber after the session ended. He did not know what he wanted to say. He had nearly filed a motion to revoke Earth's membership on the day the swarm arrived. Now he needed to understand why humanity had hidden for so long. Ambassador Yoon Sojin welcomed him warmly and listened to his question without interrupting. She thought carefully before responding. Humans had always feared what they might become. She explained they had looked at their own history and seen empires built on conquest, power used for domination, strength wielded without wisdom. When the Concord's invitation arrived, humanity had a choice. They could join the galaxy as they were, flawed and dangerous and unpredictable, or they could use their isolation to become something better. They chose to build, they chose to prepare, they chose to wait until the moment came when their strength could serve something greater than themselves. The swarm had provided that moment. Talon thanked her and returned to the archives to complete his records. He created a new entry for the species called humanity, updating their status from absent to active. He recorded their attendance at one official session and in the space reserve for noting each species' contribution to the Concord. He wrote a single word that would remain in the archives forever. Everything outside the great windows of Volterra Prime. Stars burned across the endless darkness. Somewhere among them, a blue and green world was rebuilding its fleet. Its people had given everything to protect civilizations they had never visited. They would spend the rest of their existence making sure they never had to do it alone again. The chair was no longer empty, and the galaxy was safer because humanity had finally decided to sit in it. The battle lasted 3 days. Talon Moru did not sleep during any of them, recording everything his instruments could capture while the void around him burned with weapons fire and dying ships. Human vessels fought with terrifying effectiveness, their weapons striking swarm units with precision that suggested decades of preparation. But effectiveness did not mean invincibility, and the archivists documented human deaths alongside their victories. The swarm adapted to every tactic eventually. Human formations that carved through enemy lines on the first day met heavier resistance on the second. Weapons that had destroyed thousands of machines became less effective as the swarm analyzed and adjusted. By the third day, the battle had become a grinding war of attrition that neither side could sustain indefinitely. Admiral Chomira commanded from the dreadnought Remembrance, the largest vessel in the human fleet. Talon had learned the ship's name from intercepted communications and found himself wondering about its meaning. What were the humans remembering as they fought and died for species they had never met? The answer came in fragments as he monitored. Human channels crews spoke of parents and grandparents who had built these ships. They mentioned teachers and mentors who had trained them for this exact enemy. The Remembrance was named for everyone who had contributed to humanity's secret project over 3 generations. Workers who had devoted their lives to creating weapons they hoped would never be needed. Every human ship carried a similar weight of memory and expectation. Lieutenant Kwon Yoonji was 26 years old when her fighter wing received orders to protect a Concorde hospital ship. Talon found her communication logs in the fleet archive later, piecing together her final hours from scattered transmissions. Her grandmother had worked in the Jupiter shipyards. Her mother had designed the fighter craft she flew. Yoonji had grown up knowing she might someday fight the swarm, training in simulators that recreated battles from ancient records. Now she was living the reality her family had prepared her for. The hospital ship was carrying wounded Vethrani soldiers. members of Talon's own species who had been injured in earlier fighting a swarm. Command Node had identified the vessel as a target and was directing thousands of machines toward it. Yunji's wing had 17 fighters against an enemy force they could not possibly defeat. She did not hesitate. Her last transmission was casual. Almost joking, she told her wingmates that she had always wanted to attend a Concord meeting and asked them to save her a seat at the next session. Then she accelerated toward the command node and detonated her reactor at point-blank range. The explosion destroyed the node and scrambled swarm coordination in that sector long enough for the hospital ship to escape. 17 human pilots died in that engagement. The Vethrani ship survived with 3,000 wounded soldiers aboard Talon. Added Yunji's name to his records alongside the others who had fallen. He had documented countless deaths during the battle. But hers struck him differently. She had joked about attending a meeting that her species had ignored for 73 years. She had died protecting people she had never seen from a homeworld. She had never visited. The archivist began paying closer attention to human behavior as the battle continued. He noticed patterns that contradicted everything the Concord believed about. Earth's people intelligence reports describe humans as aggressive and competitive, prone to internal conflict and tribal thinking. The humans fighting beside the Concord showed none of those traits. They prioritized civilian ships over their own damaged vessels. They threw themselves into defensive positions that guaranteed their destruction. They fought like they were protecting their own families, not strangers from alien worlds. Admiral Chomira lost 400 ships on the second day alone. She lost another 300 on the third. Each death diminished her fleet, but she never pulled back or requested relief. Human vessels simply closed ranks and continued fighting, filling gaps left by fallen comrades with the same mechanical precision they had shown from the beginning. On the third night, Talon intercepted a private transmission between Admiral Chomira and an elderly man on Earth. The man was Park Jin-ho, the chief architect who had designed humanity's fleet. They spoke briefly about losses and projections, about the swarm's central intelligence and the cost of destroying it. The Queen Mind controlled all swarm units from a heavily shielded construct. At the center of the enemy formation, destroying it would end the war permanently. Reaching it would require flying through defenses that no ship could survive. Admiral Chomira told the old man that she had made her decision. She would take the Remembrance forward alone while the rest of the fleet protected the evacuation routes. The human fleet would survive to fight another day, and the Concord would have time to rebuild. Park Jin-ho did not argue or protest. He simply told her that he was proud of what she had become, and that her parents would have been proud as well. The transmission ended, and Talon sat in the darkness of his observation post. Understanding what he had witnessed, the humans had not come to the Velen threshold seeking glory or reward. They had come knowing they might have to sacrifice everything. Admiral Chomira was preparing to give her life for species that had spent 73 years forgetting her people existed. The archivist began writing the final entry in his battle record. He did not know how the story would end, but he knew that history would remember what the humans had done. They had answered a call for help that no one had expected them to hear. They had fought harder than anyone had asked them to fight, and now their admiral was preparing to die, so that others might live. Talon hoped the galaxy would prove worthy of that sacrifice. The Concord combined fleet gathered at the Velen threshold, a region of space where ancient gravitational anomalies created natural defensive positions. 312 species had contributed vessels to the armada, ranging from massive Grundar fortress ships to swift colliery interceptors. It was the largest military assembly in 8,000 years. A desperate show of unity against an enemy that had nearly destroyed galactic civilization once before. Talon Moru had never expected to see any of this. The Vethrani archivist had been conscripted as a historical observer. assigned to document the battle for whatever future generations might survive. He stood in the observation gallery of the flagship, eternal vigilance, surrounded by officers who spoke in hushed voices about survival probabilities and evacuation contingencies. The tactical display showed the Concorde fleet as a cloud of blue. Markers' enemy projections appeared in red, an approaching wave that dwarfed their defensive force. Talon had spent his career recording treaties and trade agreements. Now he would record either a miraculous victory or the beginning of the end. Supreme Commander Veth Korol addressed the assembled fleet through system-wide broadcast. Her words were carefully chosen to inspire courage without making promises she could not keep. They would hold the line at the threshold. They would buy time for civilian evacuations. They would fight with everything they had, and history would remember their sacrifice either way. The speech ended, and the fleet began moving into defensive formations. Talon settled into his assigned station and prepared to document what would likely be his final observations. Then the sensors went blind. Every detection system in the fleet overloaded simultaneously as an impossible energy signature erupted at the edge of the threshold. Talon watched officers scramble to restore their instruments while the tactical display flickered and died. When the systems finally recovered, he did not understand what he was seeing. The space beyond the Concorde fleet was no longer empty. Ships filled the void like stars scattered across the darkness. Thousands of vessels in formations so precise they seemed artificial. Hulls gleaming with unfamiliar design elements that matched nothing in Concorde databases. Talon's 4 hands trembled as he worked his console, trying to make sense of the readings the computer kept, returning the same identification for every single vessel. Human Earth Sol System, the species that had never attended a single meeting, had just arrived with a fleet that outnumbered the entire Concorde military. Combined voices erupted across the command center as officers demanded explanations that nobody could provide. Where had the humans come from with these ships, they were asking? How could a species with 73 years of spaceflight possess more military power than civilizations that had existed for millennia? What did they want, and could they be trusted? Supreme Commander Veth Korol demanded silence and opened a channel to the newcomers. A human face appeared on the main display, a woman with graying black hair and steady eyes. She introduced herself as Fleet Admiral Cho, Mira of the United Earth Defense Force. Her tone was calm and professional, as if arriving with 11,000 warships to aid strangers was an ordinary occurrence. Admiral Cho Mira explained that humanity had monitored the swarm's approach through long-range sensors. Earth's fleet had been preparing for this enemy for decades. They had developed weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter swarm capabilities. They were here to help, and they requested permission to take point in the coming engagement. Talon watched the reactions around him with the detached attention of a Nan archivist documenting history. Some officers showed relief at the unexpected reinforcement. Others displayed suspicion and fear, wondering if humanity's hidden fleet represented a greater threat than the swarm itself. A species that could build this armada in secret, could do almost anything. Supreme Commander Veth Korol asked what the humans wanted in return for their assistance. Admiral Cho Mira's answer was simple. They wanted nothing except to help. Humanity had received the Concorde's welcome 73 years ago. They had spent those years preparing for this moment. The swarm threatened everyone, and Earth had the means to fight it. There was enough reason to act. The commander had no time for lengthy negotiations. The swarm would arrive within hours, and she had to make a decision. She granted the humans tactical authority for the engagement and ordered the Concorde fleet to adjust their formations to support positions. It was either the wisest choice in galactic history or the worst. They would find out soon enough. Talon observed the human fleet begin moving with coordination that defied explanation. Thousands of ships shifted into geometric patterns that required split-second timing across vast distances. He recognized the formations from historical archives, ancient tactical doctrines that modern civilizations had abandoned because no species could execute them effectively. The humans executed them perfectly. The swarm emerged from subspace 2 hours later. Talon had seen images in the archives, but nothing prepared him for the reality. Millions of machines poured into normal space, each one a self-replicating weapon designed for nothing except destruction and consumption. They moved like a living thing, a tide of metal and hunger that had swept away civilizations far greater than the Concorde. The human fleet met them head-on. Admiral Mira gave no speeches and offered no dramatic declarations. She simply ordered her ships forward, and 11,000 vessels advanced into the mechanical swarm like a blade cutting through water. Talon watched the first human weapons fire and felt his breath catch in his throat. The Concorde had been fighting a war of survival for 3 days against swarm advance units. Human weapons tore through swarm formations like they were made of paper. Ships that should have been overwhelmed by machine numbers instead carved paths of destruction through enemy lines. The archivist began recording everything he could, knowing that this battle would be studied for millennia to come. He did not understand how the humans had built these weapons or trained these crews. He only knew that the species, which had missed every meeting for 73 years, was now fighting harder than anyone else to protect civilizations they had never even visited. The war for galactic survival had finally begun, and humanity had arrived to face it. Park Jin-ho stood at the observation window of Titan Station 7, watching cargo vessels move between construction platforms that stretched across the orange moon's horizon. He was 84 years old now, his hair completely white and his hands marked with the tremors that came with age, but his eyes remained sharp, and his mind still held every detail of the project he had overseen for more than 4 decades. Behind him, screens displayed production reports from every facility in the Sol System shipyard. Omega at Jupiter had completed its final vessel. Yesterday, the Mercury foundries had finished their last batch of hull plating this morning. After 41 years of continuous construction, humanity's secret work was finally done. Jinho remembered the day everything changed. He had been a young engineer when the Galactic Concorde's welcome package arrived on Earth. The transmission contained star charts showing thousands of inhabited worlds, translation software for hundreds of languages, and an invitation to join an alliance that had maintained peace for 12 millennia. It also contained historical archives, including detailed records of every threat the Concorde had faced. The Harrow Swarm appeared in those records as a nightmare from ancient times. Self-replicating machines that had consumed 17 civilizations before being driven away at tremendous cost. The archives noted that the swarm had retreated beyond the galactic rim but had never been destroyed. Someday, the records warned they would return. Earth's government studied that warning carefully. They looked at humanity's position in the galaxy, a single world with newly developed faster-than-light technology, and they considered their options. They could join the Concorde as a minor species, contributing what little they had to the collective defense, or they could use their isolation to prepare for a threat that more established civilizations seemed content to ignore. The decision was made in secret meetings that the public never learned about humanity would not attend the Concorde's gatherings. Instead, humanity would build. Jinho had been recruited straight from the engineering academy. His first assignment was designing automated mining systems for the asteroid belt. Those systems had operated continuously for 4 decades now, extracting metals and rare elements that fed the hungry shipyards orbiting every planet in the Sol system. He had watched the project grow from a handful of secret facilities to an industrial network that transformed their entire star system. Mars hosted the primary fleet command center, its surface covered with training facilities, where crews prepared for battles they hoped would never come. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn had become manufacturing complexes producing weapons and ship components. Venus orbital stations processed materials that required extreme heat. Even distant Pluto contributed its ice mine for fusion fuel that powered the endless construction. 3 generations of humans had devoted their lives to this work. Engineers designed ships based on every scrap of intelligence they could gather about galactic warfare. Scientists developed weapons specifically targeted at swarm weaknesses identified in ancient records. Soldiers trained in simulators for battles against an enemy that might not appear for centuries, and through it all, they maintained absolute secrecy from the wider galaxy. No human vessel had ever traveled beyond the Sol system's boundaries. No human signal had responded to Concorde communications. Earth appeared to any outside observer as a primitive world that had somehow achieved FTL travel and then collapsed back into isolation. The truth was far different. Jinho's personal communicator activated. With a priority alert, he turned from the window to read the message, and his aged heart began beating faster. Long-range sensors had detected the Harrow swarm emerging from dark space. The machines were heading toward Concorde territory. Exactly as the ancient records had predicted, humanity's moment had finally arrived. He made his way to the command center, walking slowly through corridors filled with young officers who snapped to attention as he passed. These children had grown up knowing their purpose. Their parents had built the ships, and their grandparents had designed them. Now this generation would finally use what their ancestors had created. Fleet Admiral Cho Myra was waiting in the command center when Jinho arrived. She had been his student 30 years ago, a brilliant tactical mind who had risen through the ranks to command humanity's entire military force. Her black hair was streaked with gray now, and lines marked her face from years of responsibility. But she stood straight and steady as activation orders went out across the system. Jinho watched the main display as thousands of signals responded to the fleet-wide alert ships that had waited in construction bays for decades powered up their engines for the first time. Crews who had trained their entire lives reported to vessels they had only seen in simulations. The scale of it still amazed him. Even after all these years, 11,427 warships, carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and dreadnoughts, experimental vessels carrying weapons that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. 3 generations of fear and preparation, all coming online in a single coordinated awakening. Admiral Cho Myra turned to him with an expression he could not quite read. She asked if he had any words for the moment, any wisdom to share before they committed to this path. Jinho thought about all the years of secrecy and sacrifice. He thought about the workers who had died in construction accidents, the families who had kept silent about their loved ones' true work, the children who had grown up training for a war they might never see. He told her that humanity had spent 73 years building the power to protect others. Now they would discover if they had the courage to use it. Admiral Myra nodded and turned to her communications officer. She dictated a brief message to be transmitted to the Galactic Concorde. The first official human communication since the original welcome package had arrived 3/4 of a century ago. The message was simple. We apologize for our absence. We were busy. We are coming to help. The transmission went out across faster than light channels. Jinho returned to his window and watched the first wave of ships begin moving toward the system's edge. His life's work was leaving home. He hoped it would be enough. The great assembly hall of Velthary Prime stretched for nearly 2 kilometers in every direction, its ceiling lost in artificial clouds that shifted colors with the mood of the gathered delegates. 847 species had sent representatives to this monthly session, filling tiered platforms that rose like mountains around the central speaking floor. Creatures of every imaginable shape occupied their designated spaces, from the serpentine colliery, who coiled around heated perches, to the massive stone-like Grundar, who required reinforced platforms to support their tremendous weights. Senior Archivist Talon Morrow walked through the lower corridors with a stack of formal documents clutched in 2 of his forearms. His pale blue skin reflected the bioluminescent lighting that the Vethrani preferred, and his large eyes scanned the chamber numbers as he searched for his destination. He had served the Galactic Concorde for 63 years, cataloging treaties and recording the endless debates that shape civilization across 10,000 star systems. Today, he carried a motion that should have been filed decades ago. Chamber 7. 291 was located in a forgotten corner of the station, far from the prestigious positions near the central floor. Talon had asked 3 maintenance workers for directions before finding the correct corridor. When he finally stood before the door, he noticed dust on the access panel. Nobody had entered this room in years. The door slid open to reveal a space converted into storage. Cleaning supplies occupied the delegate seating area. Boxes of old documents filled the speaking platform. A single flag hung crookedly on the wall, its colors faded but still recognizable as the blue and green banner of a planet called Earth. Talon sighed and began documenting the chamber's condition for his formal report. 73 years ago, the species known as humans had achieved faster than light travel. The Concorde had followed standard protocols, transmitting a welcome package that included star charts, translation matrices, and an invitation to join galactic civilization. A delegation chamber had been prepared and credentials issued to a woman named Yun Misuk, who was supposed to become humanity's first ambassador. She never arrived. Her shuttle experienced a catastrophic engine failure during the journey to Velthary Prime. The humans requested a delay to investigate the accident and select a replacement. The Concorde granted their request, expecting the new delegate within a standard cycle. That cycle passed, then another, then dozens more. Reports filtered through trading vessels about political upheaval on Earth, environmental disasters, and resource conflicts that consumed human attention. Each generation of Concorde administrators expected the humans to finally appear, but the delegation chamber remained empty. Most species eventually forgot that humans existed at all. Talon finished his inspection and made his way to the main assembly floor. The session had already begun, with the current speaker addressing concerns about shipping routes through the Velen threshold. He found his assigned observation post and settled into his seat, the formal revocation motion waiting in his document case. When the shipping discussion concluded, he would present his recommendation to officially remove Earth from Concorde membership. It was a formality at this point. The humans were either dead or had chosen permanent isolation. Either way, their empty chamber served no purpose except to waste space. The shipping debate dragged on for nearly 2 hours before reaching a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Talon prepared to request speaking time when every communication device in the assembly hall activated simultaneously. Emergency alerts flashed across screens in hundreds of languages. The Concorde's automated defense network had detected a massive incursion at the outer boundary of protected space. Talon watched the main display filled with sensor data that made his blood run cold. The Harrow swarm had returned. Every species in the assembly knew the stories, though most had hoped the ancient enemy would never reappear in their lifetimes. The swarm was not a civilization, but a hunger-given mechanical form, self-replicating machines that consumed everything they encountered, breaking down planets and stars to fuel their endless expansion. 17 civilizations had fallen to the swarm before the Concorde's ancestors finally drove them beyond the galactic rim. That victory had cost billions of lives and nearly shattered the alliance that would become the modern Concorde. Now the machines had returned. Emerging from dark space with numbers that defied comprehension, Supreme Commander Veth Karal took the central platform, her scaled face grim as she addressed the assembly. 3 colony worlds in the outer territories had already gone silent long range. Sensors showed swarm units numbering in the millions, advancing toward populated systems at speeds that would bring them to core worlds within 2 months. The commander called for an immediate vote to mobilize the combined defense fleet. Every military vessel from every member species would gather at the Velen threshold to intercept the swarm before it could reach major population centers. The vote passed unanimously in less than a minute. Delegates rushed from the assembly hall to contact their governments. Ships that had been idle for generations would need to be activated. Crews would need to be assembled and trained. Weapons that existed only in emergency stockpiles would need to be distributed. Talon remained in his seat long after the hall emptied. His revocation motion sat forgotten in his document case as he stared at the tactical projections still displayed on the main screen. The Concorde's combined military strength represented the greatest force assembled in 8,000 years, according to the projections. They had approximately a 23% chance of victory. He thought about the empty chamber with its dusty flag and forgotten cleaning supplies. He thought about the humans who had received their invitation and never responded wherever they were. Whatever had happened to them, they had made the right choice by staying away. This war would likely end the Galactic Concorde. There was no point in dragging another species into extinction. Talon finally stood and made his way toward the archives. Someone needed to record what was happening. Someone needed to preserve the memory of 847 civilizations for whatever came after. He would do his duty until the very end, documenting the final days of galactic society with the same care he had given to centuries of treaties and trade agreements. As he walked, he passed Chamber 7291 without stopping. The revocation motion could wait. It hardly mattered now whether the humans were officially removed from membership in an organization that might not exist in 3 months. The blue and green flag would hang in that forgotten room until the swarm came to tear down the station itself. And somewhere across the galaxy, on a world that had never bothered to answer its invitation, humanity remained silent. They had missed every meeting for 73 years. They would miss the final one as well.